Hello, everyone, and welcome to History 105. This is Professor Hasselman. And this week we're learning about life in Europe after the Middle Ages. And as you have already read through or continue to read the material this week, you'll begin we began with the late Middle Ages, and then we moved into the Renaissance. Now, this period of change has greatly influenced Western civilization, but what really changed during this time period? As you complete the reading this week, we'll also be asking this and other questions, and it will also allow us to look at how historians develop periods in history. What events do we use to demarcate time and the story of mankind? So you've probably already done the reading this week, but I thought I'd take a little time to talk more about one of the changes that occurred during this time period, the way that artists depicted events and how art changed from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. And I'll also be talking about how society and culture was kind of organized during this time period as well, to kind of emphasize some of the things that we depicted in medieval and Renaissance art. So when you look at medieval art painting, or medieval painting, and then a Renaissance painting, you might notice that something is very different. So in this picture you see on the screen here, the top two are what we consider medieval art, and the bottom two would be considered Renaissance art. The Renaissance paintings look more real. The people in the Renaissance paintings seem more like real people than in the medieval paintings, and there are a number of reasons for this. So first, the vast majority of medieval paintings depicted religious figures, especially the Virgin Mary, Jesus, and the saints. Now, the painting was intended to show the importance of the figure in the hierarchic way. Jesus before the Virgin Mary before the saints, and the saints before anyone else. Now, the primary figure was always larger than any other figure to demonstrate its importance. Thus, the people in the medieval paintings look strangely unreal. Now, second, in medieval art, the religious event was depicted in serial fashion, so that all the key episodes were in one frame. There was no sense of a snapshot in time, because God was not in or of time. And the last thing that the medieval artist was inclined to do was to represent anything from the human perspective or life as experienced by human beings. That didn't matter in these religious depictions. Third, the religious figures hardly show any emotion, as you can see in both of these pictures here. If they did, they would be like humans, and the goal was to show the eternal and the transcendent, not the feelings of the moment. And finally, there was no depth to medieval art. The scenery behind the figures was not intended to show a backdrop and perspective to the figures. It was often disorganized and highlighted physical objects that were important by size, with no concern for showing a realistic geography or depth in space. And the paintings appear flat intentionally. So medieval art, mostly religious characters, depicted in a serial fashion, figures hardly showed any emotion, and there was very little depth. Now, Renaissance painting, on the other hand, in every way is taking the human view or experience. The Renaissance artist and critic Leon Battista Alberti, in his treatise on painting entitled Della Pittura, or Of Painting, says that the picture plane should be treated as an open window. The human being looks into the window, and time and space are stopped. What the human sees is reflections of his own experiences and views. He's drawn into the window precisely because the artist is able to reflect what is human back to the human being. So there's several ways that the Renaissance artist does this. So first, the figures are all the same scale, not larger or smaller because of importance. Rather, they're arranged on a canvas in a center to a peripheral position, indicating with position a descending scale of importance. Second, the figures are not placid, but showing human emotions. The Virgin Mary, for example, would often show despair. Jesus doubles over in real pain. The saints cower in fear. And the religious figure is shown naked as if to expose his very humanity and the artist's skill at producing a human form, and as the classic Greeks and the Romans did. Third, the background becomes vitally important in a Renaissance painting, not only to provide a fixed snapshot in space and time, but also to provide realistic depth and a three-dimensional quality. Depth, or the illusion of depth, was achieved in Renaissance art by a new emphasis on geometry and the rules of perspective. Artists would literally set up the composition of the picture by drawing in preliminary lines on the canvas first. Figures in the forefront were larger and figures at the back smaller, creating a sense of distance. And moreover, perspective required that the painting have a triangle that resulted in the top angle becoming a vanishing point. And I'll go into this a little more detail here. So again, Renaissance art, figures are the same scale. A couple that I don't have in the list here. The figures are not placid, but they often show emotions. The background becomes very vital, and what's going on in the background is really important. And then the depth, or the illusion of depth. Now, to explain how perspective revolutionized Renaissance painting, we're going to compare the work of two artists, Giotto di Bondone and Masaccio, or Tommaso di Ser Giovanni di Simone. So, these two artists represent the beginning of Renaissance painting, even though Giotto lived in a full century before Masaccio. Now, Giotto had died several centuries before the period that is usually accepted as the beginning of the Renaissance, around 1370. Now, while fully in the medieval artistic tradition in most of the characteristics already described, Giotto was beginning to pull away from those traditions of his later paintings. In particular, we see some effort to provide perspective in his paintings. Jesus before the calf, as you see on the screen here, Giotto portrays Jesus as very large and other figures small, as in the medieval tradition, but he seems to be trying to give some depth to the room. But the perspective is not well done. The vanishing point is disorganized, as you can see in the linear analysis on the right. Now, Masaccio was born nearly a century after Giotto's paintings. He was mentored in Rome by Filippo Brunelleschi, the greatest architect of his time, who used linear perspective and mathematics to achieve perfection in the building of domes and other arches. Now, Masaccio applied these principles to painting on canvas and ushered in the early Renaissance style. Now, though he died young, his paintings and frescoes had a profound effect on other paintings, particularly his use of perspective. An example is his painting, The Tribute Money, which you see right here, which he painted in 1425. All the human figures are of the same scale, but Jesus is important because he is in the middle. Now, the figures appear human-like and in movement, and the backdrop gives a historic feel to the moment in time. Now, but most important of all is Masaccio's powerful grasp of perspective. The painting itself has mathematical precision in this regard. The scenery behind is a bit large, but the patio and the building to the right are following a linear perspective that creates a vanishing point above Jesus' head. The central figures of the painting are within the triangle, and they are also on the same level at the base. And we can see this by overlaying perspective triangles, as we see here, over the painting. So we can see this perspective, we can follow these lines, and as we go further back, things get smaller with that vanishing point. So let's take a closer look at two other works by these artists and kind of look at this question as to, if we look at this Flight into Egypt and Masaccio's The Expulsion from the Garden of Eden, left and right respectively, what's the difference that makes the first a medieval and the second a Renaissance painting? So if we go back and really quickly look at our views here, so religious medieval art, we have religious characters, serial fashion, figures hardly showing emotion, no depth. In the Renaissance, we have more emotion being shown. The figures are the same scale. The depth of illusion is obviously present. And then we also have a different organization. So if we look at these two paintings, the one on the left is from 1304, which is in more of the medieval style, and the one on the right shows beginnings to our Renaissance style. So taking a look at the one on the left, we can see obviously there's religious figures here, right? But there are religious figures in the one on the right as well. So could they both be medieval art, or are they both Renaissance art? Now, of course, the main picture, the flight to Egypt, is the story from biblical times of Mary, Joseph, and Jesus leaving Egypt while they were trying to track down and do the census, both the census and also track down those people who may have been bringing the Messiah into the world. And so they're leaving Egypt at this time, and they're taking off from Egypt. And what we see here, go back here. What we see here is the main picture, of course, the main depiction is that as Jesus and Mary on the donkey here, right? And of course, they're larger than everyone else that is there. The background is also not in very much perspective. It's a little difficult for us to see. We also have this angel floating around the background, and we have people in the front, but they just appear to be on the exact same plane as Mary and Jesus, and Joseph's also larger than everybody else, but they don't seem in very good perspective, right? There also is not a lot of emotion shown on their faces, right? They're just pretty straight, very straight-faced, Mary looks a little upset in this image, but she just looks very stern and powerful, right? Now on the right side, we have this kind of written a little different here. It's very similar in terms of what's being depicted here. In this case, it's the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve being expelled from Eden after eating from the tree of knowledge. And we have a couple religious depictions that carried over from medieval period. We've got this light, or the sound of God kicking them out of the Garden of Eden, and we've got the angel with the sword, the kind of kicking them out and forcing them out as well. Now, some of the differences here, the people seem a little more realistic. They look more like human beings, not like cartoons that we see from the first one. And there's also emotion shown on their faces. We have Eve, who looks like she's in despair, and Adam, who looks very sad as well. There's also a greater sense of motion in this picture, as we can see there. Even though we know they're moving here with the horse's foot, with the donkey's foot up, but there isn't really a sense of forward motion by anyone else. Whereas in this case, it looks like they are being expelled, and it's very clear that they are very, very, very upset to have to leave. We have a little bit of perspective here. We've got the background kind of disappearing and moving back, and some of the shadows. Not the best of the depiction of this time, but as you can see, both are very good examples of differences as the move from medieval into Renaissance art and some of the changes that occurred. Now, the Bondone picture on the left also tries to do some perspective, a little bit, very, very proto perspective, with the images getting a little bit smaller in the background, but it still just looks like layers are stacked upon layers. So hopefully when you're looking at your art in your discussion this week, you're kind of looking at some of the differences and pointing out some of those differences between how art was depicted in medieval times, specifically how it depicted the Black Plague. Now, we may ask, what's the big deal? Why are these changes so historic, and how did people react to these changes? Now, when we study history, one of the concepts that we analyze, and that you read about during the first week, is the concept of change over time. However, change is not always inevitable. Sometimes we also focus on continuity, or the lack of change. Now, in this course, we're going to see many different changes to the way society was ordered. So to better understand this, we're going to turn to a concept that helped us organize and solidify the different hierarchies that existed in Europe. If you remember at the beginning of this discussion, of this lecture, I had talked about how the images depicted hierarchies. The higher they were up and closer to God, the larger they were, and the farther away they were, the smaller that they were. Now, better understanding the way society was supposed to be organized and how it actually existed will help us understand the way why there was resistance to new ideas. So in our discussion here, we're going to be talking about this concept known as the Great Chain of Being. Now, this Great Chain of Being posited an ordered being, B-E-I-N-G, great chain, like a chain link, right? Great chain of being. This posited an ordered, hierarchical universe in which every creature, especially humans, was placed in a particular rank by God. Now, to rebel against that order, even to try to rise higher than one's place at birth, was to challenge God's own mandate. But as Europe emerged from the Middle Ages, the great chain of being was being challenged and strained by forces in politics, society, religion, and even in culture. And those forces will be the subject of this course. Now, in 1500, most European men and women were what we would call today Catholics. All European men, women, and children were taught that God created the universe, ordered it, and was active in its everyday working. When asked to describe the universe and its parts, late medieval commentators fell back on metaphors, and one of their favorite metaphors was that of the body politic. A more comprehensive metaphor, because it took into account God and all the creatures, was the great chain of being. So the body politic, like the king is the king is the state, and all the people make up the king, right? Whereas this case, the great chain of being not only includes the king, but also all other aspects on this as well. Now, Europeans also generally believed in what was known as the Ptolemaic universe, or a series of concentric spheres with the Earth in the center. Now, Copernicus published his revolution of the celestial spheres in 1543, but this idea that the Earth is not the center but of the heliocentric theory that we'll learn about when we learn about the scientific revolution, but his ideas would only begin to gain ground around 1600. Now, in 1500, most people believed that that moving from the outer sphere inward, the universe consisted of the stars, as you can see on the screen here, the stars, the planets, the sun, the moon, and at the center we have Earth. And at the center of Earth were the flames of hell. So if we look at our image here, excuse me, let's go back here. As we look at our image, let me put my pointer on so you can see a bit here. We have the stars on the outside, planets moving in, and then we have Earth here in the middle. Now, as this implies, when they thought about the inhabitants of that universe, they thought of a hierarchy. So what we're going to see here on the screen is this great chain of being and kind of how it was organized. So at the top, we had the celestial hierarchy. The celestial hierarchy consisted of God and the angels, man, animals, plants, and stones. So as you see on the left here. There are 5 things to remember about this system. Those at the top of the hierarchy were closer to God than those at the bottom. Humankind is halfway down the chain, suspended between the angels and the animals. And apart from God, each of the ranks in this chain would be divided even further. Angels were divided into 9 ranks, the animals and the plants, and stone hierarchies could be similarly divided as well, and so with man. Okay, so man was divided up into kings, aristocrats, and peasants, laborers and the poor. And these ranks could even be further subdivided, right? So every rank might be further divided into families with genders ranked. And then in theory, every single creature and object in God's universe could be placed precisely in this hierarchy. The top of each part of the chain is analogous to the head of the whole chain. And God himself is at the top. Clearly, the people of Europe in 1500 were obsessed with order. And by the same token, their greatest fear was disorder. Now, as we can see on the screen right here, as this image depicts here, we have the king, and then we have aristocrats, which can be broken up into lesser aristocracy, not greater aristocracy. And those can be split up even from top to bottom. And then we have the peasant class, which are separated up into substantial farmers, small farmers, cottagers, laborers, and the poor. And then the family can also be broken up into a hierarchy with the father at the top, mother underneath, male children in birth order, and then female children in birth order. Now, the chain, of course, is a chain, not a ladder. Because the chain was considered to be God's plan, it was a grave sin to attack the chain, disobey one's superiors, or rebel against the king, or even try to rise to another rank. Now, clearly, European society in 1500 valued order, not opportunity, conformity, not originality, and community, not individuality. The top 3 ranks of the human chain represented less than 10% of the population, and that 10% owned perhaps 50% of the land in Europe and possessed nearly 100% of the power. And we might well ask why the other 90% of people put up with this system. Now, the system was drilled into the people of Europe from the pulpit every Sunday. After all, it explained their universe and probably did prevent disorder that they would otherwise have been unable to stop. Now, imagine what a European from 1500 would think of the violence, noise, and chaos of our world today. So that's one reason. So it was preached to them at the pulpit. Another explanation for widespread acceptance of the chain can be found in two related beliefs designed to mitigate the worst effects of inequality: paternalism and deference. Now, paternalism was the belief also taught from every pulpit in Europe and often embodied in proclamation and law that those at the upper end of the chain had a responsibility to look after those below them. Deference, that is, allegiance, obedience, and respect, was the attitude that the lower orders were supposed to display towards those at the top of the chain. Thus, in the European universe of 1500, every man, woman, and child knew where he or she stood. Now, the chain, of course, was an ideal of order and stability, but life is very messy and mutable. And as our course opens, the ideal of the chain fits less and less well with the realities of European life. The composition of the various ranks changed. The nobility were supposedly the oldest, most distinguished families in Europe, but some noble families were upstarts, receiving their titles through royal favor or court service rather than military services in the past. And other families died out or were deprived of their titles or conviction of treason. As a result, the oldest families were, in fact, constantly renewed with new blood. Peasants rose and fell with fluctuations in the economy and the fluctuations in the weather. Now, some people fell out of the chain entirely by forming chains of their own that did not seem to fit into the main social hierarchy. So hopefully you got a really good understanding of kind of how Europe was organized and how this hierarchy was not just believed and understood and looked at in theory, but also depicted in artwork as well.